So there were perhaps generations of people who lived in poverty while their money, they probably were completely unaware that their money was being paid.
Who knows? Maybe we paid for the Second World War, the First World War. Maybe we paid for the Vietnam War. Maybe we paid for the war against Korea. Maybe we paid for the war against Iraq, Afghanistan, El Salvador, Nicaragua. Where did the money go? They can't tell us. The Secretary of the Interior, Gail Norton, and before that, the other Secretary of the Interior, Bruce Babbitt, were both cited for civil contempt because they can't come up with our money.
But no penalty. They get no penalties.
They ought to throw them in prison, just like they ought to throw a banker in prison for doing the same thing. So this is what we're faced with. This is the kind of relationship we have with this government of the United States. Fact is, in the Trail of Broken Treaties, as an introduction to the preamble, we said this to the U.S. government in 1972. We want a new relationship with you, an honest one.
So, going back again then to the comment you made about different denominations being, it sounds like the reservation and the population of the reservation was carved up and parceled out to different denominations of Christians to do whatever they were going to do.
The biggest holder of Indian land today is the Catholic Church. Probably the Mormons are second, and then the Episcopalians. But not only did they get that plot of land to build their churches and missions on, but they acquired vast acreages of our land following that. So, you know, what they ought to do is realize they failed us, and in the spirit of their great benefactor, Jesus Christ, they ought to give that land back, all of it. And all their facilities and institutions, they ought to give it back to the tribe, and we can develop our own school systems, which is what we're doing anyhow.
Well, my question was, as these different Christian denominations who are kind of famous for fighting amongst themselves, I mean, even recently I think the Baptists set out to convert Christians and Episcopalians to be Baptists, and the Catholics were all upset about it. Did this have the effect of dividing the community? Did the native people, some of them, view themselves as Protestant or as Mormon, and so I guess did this have an effect of affecting the identity that the people had? You know, and you had also mentioned that there were enclaves of traditionalists. You know, where were they? Were they literally out in the remote areas?
Oh, yes.
And how did, you know, I guess sort of how did this denominational parceling up affect the social structure of the community?
Well, obviously, overall it had a negative impact, but as far as creating more factions, I don't think that was the case. I never did sense that was the case. I think that people always respected one another's visions of what how they wanted to worship. So I don't think that was ever the case. But what it did do is that it brainwashed a lot of our people who eventually became leaders under the Indian Reorganization Act, where they deposed our traditional leadership, which we're doing again right now in Iraq, incidentally, the Iraqi Reorganization Act. We already had the Indian Reorganization Act, and one of our prominent leaders, Tony Blackfeather, has written a good paper on that, which can be found on our website under the international division. But what it did is it brainwashed a lot of our leaders who became tribal chairmen and members of the council, who oftentimes were more subservient to the white dominant off-reservation and on-reservation communities than they were toward their own people. Stripped them of their language, their culture, their traditional spiritual way of life, and many of them sort of function, and I hate to use the term, but I guess it best describes a two-bit facsimile of the dominant oppressor. So it's had a lot of problems, but a lot of our people have now rejected the church, the Christian church, and have gone back to the sacred pipe, the Chinoopa, the sweat lodge ceremonies, the sun dances. In the case of the Ojibwe and other tribes up in the Great Lakes region here, the Midday ceremony, which on other programs I'll have some of our people talk in more depth about the importance of all of that. But what we're doing is we've really developed a new leadership today. A young man, a young woman that has their own language, their own traditional spiritual values, ceremonies, way of life intact. So obviously the American Indian movement has made a major contribution to our future.